Good afternoon, church. Happy Sunday. I'm really excited about today's lesson. I'm really excited about this series that we're embarking on today, where we're going to be studying out the entire story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. It's called Pathway to Partnership. And before we even get into it today, I want to talk about why we're doing this series. Why Abraham? Why look into this Sunday school character? Well, there are a bunch of reasons, but the main one is that I believe, and our church believes, that this is the inspired word of God that we're working with. The Bible is inspired by God, and so it has the power to continually inspire us, no matter how many times that we read it. You know, the story of Abraham was part of the Jewish oral tradition, right? It was this story that was passed down from generation to generation to educate people on what this world was all about and who God was. And the idea behind these stories was that you'd hear them over and over and over again at different times in your life, and it would impact you in new ways based on your new experiences. Hopefully the same thing rings true this time as we read through the story of Abraham. You know, the main point, the key idea that we're going to be coming back to over and over again in this series is that God created the world for us. And so he's looking for partners. God is looking for partners to redeem the world, to save the world. And that's going to bring up some really interesting and some really important questions about that idea of partnership, right? The first is that, okay, why? Why does God want partners? Why would the creator of the universe need human beings as partners? What made Abraham such a good partner? And for us, well, what would a potential partnership with God even look like for me? What kind of partner do I want to be for God? And what kind of person would I need to become in order to be a good partner to God? These are all key questions. We're going to keep coming back to them over and over again. Today's lesson is titled Hidden in Genealogy. That's right, we're looking at a genealogy today. But before we even get into any of that, any of the genealogical stuff, we got to do a little bit of context. Not in the context corner. We'll do it right here. Thank you very much. We're going to talk about the setup, the context that explains who Abraham is and where God's at when Abraham finally meets God. It's helpful to think about the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible that the Jews worked with, as kind of this big, long story with 5 different acts. And the first act, the first part of it, before any of the acts, is Genesis 1 through 11. It's kind of a preface or a prologue. A lot of stories have kind of a preface, and in that preface you set up key themes and ideas, and you kind of build out the world. Think about Lord of the Rings, right? Before the story of the Lord of the Rings, there's this little clip at the beginning of the first movie, right? Where the elves defeat Sauron, the ring goes missing, and there's this narration of like, myth became legend, legend became whatever, right? This is a preface. It builds out the world. It explains the world that the story is going to happen in. And the Bible does the exact same thing in Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis 12 through 50, the rest of Genesis, is kind of Act 1. It's the story of how God finds and works with his partner family, right? It's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, all these guys that you've known for a long time. These people, this family, is who God chooses to work with and partner with. Then Acts 2 through 5, well, that's Exodus through Deuteronomy, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but essentially God rescues his people, he reunites with his people, and he establishes like a marriage covenant with his people. It's this cool little marriage story between God and the nation of Israel. But I don't want to get into that. That's past what we're going to look at. I want to look first off at Genesis 1 through 11. I want to look at the preface. And one way of looking at the preface, as you can see right here, is in 8 distinct chapters, right? There's these kind of, I know there's like chapter 1, chapter 2 that you see in your Bible, but there's kind of 8 little movements, 8 little chapters that sort of explain the world that we're about to be thrown into, right? Genesis 1, well, that's creation. You know that story, 7 days, 7 nights. And what we see, the key ideas that we see in the creation story is that God has created a good world, right? In fact, God calls it exceedingly good. And we learn something about the character of God in this story. God takes a Sabbath rest and he stops working. And we see a God who knows when to say enough. This is a God who doesn't have to keep building and adding and adding. He knows when to stop. And this is a key component of God's character. This is really going to help us understand who God is and who we're called to be. But Genesis 2-3, we see a tragedy, the tragedy of Adam and Eve, because Adam and Eve don't trust the story that God is writing. They don't trust God. They don't trust his plan for creation. And they become obsessed with acquiring more and more knowledge. And it ends tragically with them getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden. Chapter 4 of Genesis, well, that's Cain and Abel, right? This is another story that we've known for a long time. It's an echo of the Adam and Eve story. It's another chapter of people mistrusting God, getting obsessed with acquiring status and obsessed with acquiring more power and control. And it's this huge second tragedy. And so what does God do in chapter 5? We see a genealogy. God kind of hits the reset button. He presses pause for a little while. And we have a few generations pass, and then the cycle renews itself. Chapters 6 through the beginning of 9, it's a story not of creation, but of destruction. It's Noah's Ark. And God decides, you know what? I got to restart with humanity. I got to destroy human beings, except for this one family. And in this story, we see the same pattern. This is God who knows when to say enough to destruction. At first, God knew when to stop creating. Now God knows when to stop destroying. Again, this is not a God who's going to wipe out everything. He knows when to stop, and he stops with Noah's family. But we have another tragedy. 9b-10, this is Noah's curse. Noah curses his sons in this really crazy, insane tragedy. And we see that Noah is following God's lead in destruction, but he doesn't know when to stop. This is the same problem that Adam and Eve had. They couldn't stop acquiring. Well, Noah can't stop destroying. And he kind of destroys his own family by cursing his son. It's a mess. Chapter 11, part A, is the Tower of Babel. Another familiar story, right? And we see echoes of mistrust and this tragedy of people trying to acquire, and there's nothing we can't do. And so God has to stop it. This is, again, people not trusting the story of God. And so in 11b, which is actually what we're going to be studying today, Genesis 11b, God hits the reset button again. He goes through a few more generations. And what we see is this cycle, this unfortunate pattern played out twice in history where God displays who he is. He knows when to say enough. He can create, he can destroy, but he knows when to stop. The human beings that he loves, though, don't know when to stop. They always go too far with it. We would call that sin. And it's this tragedy of not trusting God's story. These echoes of mistrust and tragedy and obsession, they continue for a little bit until God hits the genealogical reset button. He starts anew with a new generation of people. And there's these themes in this story that will profoundly impact the way we read Abraham's story. There's this idea of trusting the story, trusting God's plan for creation and God's plan for humanity. We have the idea of knowing when to say enough, not being obsessed or taking things too far, problems that Adam had, Cain had, Noah had. And we see this idea that God is looking for a partner. He thinks that Adam's going to be his partner, but Adam's not a good partner. He goes, okay, maybe it's Cain. I'll talk to Cain. Well, Cain's not a very good partner either. Noah proves eventually that he's not an ideal partner. And when we get to Abraham, we see that God is desperately seeking the right person, someone who gets it, someone who's going to be a good partner, someone who trusts the story, someone who understands when to stop and when to say enough. God at this point is saying, who's going to work with me rather than against me? Who's going to trust me instead of trusting themselves? And something interesting, right at the center of Genesis 1-11, almost literally at the exact center of this passage of scripture, we see this in Genesis 5:28-29. This is kind of the mission statement or the hypothesis or whatever you want to call it of this entire passage of scripture. It says, when Lamech had lived 182 years, he had a son. He named him Noah, and said, he will comfort us in the labor and painful toil of our hands caused by the ground the Lord has cursed. Okay, why is this the mission statement of everything that's happened so far? Well, the name Noah sounds exactly like the Hebrew word Naham. It's Noah, Naham. Say that with me. Noah, Naham. You guys are like natural Hebrew speakers. Good job. These two words sound exactly alike. And this idea, Naham, means comfort. And that's why Noah gets the name that he gets. It means comfort. And it's this mission statement of like, okay, are people going to let me comfort them? Or are they going to choose the painful toil of sin? What are human beings going to choose? This is the cycle. This is the story that gets played out twice in Genesis 1 through 11. Okay, are we going to choose toil and obsession and not knowing when to say enough? Are we going to trust God's story, trust God's comfort, and know when to say enough? This is a story that it's almost guaranteed that you've seen in your life to some degree, right? Times where you've taken things too far, when you've gotten obsessed, when you've fallen into sin and you haven't trusted God's story. In this story, we see echoes of our story, and I think that's the coolest thing in the world. This movement, Genesis 1 through 11, it teaches us the keys to being a good partner to God. It teaches us that we need to not be obsessed with acquiring or obsessed with destroying. We need to know when to say enough, and we need to trust God's story. And so finally, thanks for hanging with me for 12 minutes. Finally, we get to Avram, right? Abraham, our hero for the next 5 weeks. And we're going to look at a story in Genesis 11 in a genealogy that perfectly explains why Abraham is the perfect partner for God. Let's check it out. In Genesis 11, 27 through 32. I know it's a genealogy. Trust me, there is a pearl, a diamond hidden in this genealogy that you're going to love. 11 verse 27. This is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Avram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. When his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Avram and Nahor both married. The name of Avram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran, the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. Terah took his son Avram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Avram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into Canaan. When they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and he died in Haran. Okay, why focus on a genealogy? Is there anything to be learned here? Well, for an Eastern audience, primarily a Jewish audience, family mattered. Things like genealogies are super boring to us because we're Westerners, but to Easterners, they think genealogy is the coolest thing because a genealogy explains who you are. It explains where you come from. And these terms like Terah, Milcah, Iscah, Avram, Nahor, like they mattered. They have meaning. And so an Easterner, a young Jewish person would read through this genealogy and they would learn so much about who Avram was. That's what we're going to do today. We're going to look at this genealogy and we're going to learn more about who Avram is. Now, did you pick up on how weird this family is? Did you pick up on all the weird stuff going on? The writer seems to have some kind of like ADD or something because he keeps jumping from person to topic to idea. It's really confusing. And so I made a family tree to kind of hopefully explain a little bit of what's going on here. So we have this guy Terah. And Terah is the father of 3 sons. He's the father of Avram, Nahor, and Haran. I'm trying to do kind of like the Hebrew pronunciation. I'm probably going to do a bad job, but just bear with me. Now, Haran is the father of Lot and Milcah and Iscah, but originally right there we see something really, really weird. Avram is the first son mentioned, and so he should be the oldest. But him and Nahor have not gotten married yet. The youngest son, Haran, is the one who gets married. That's weird. In this society, in this culture, the oldest son always got married first because the oldest son was the one who was supposed to continue his father's legacy. So it's weird that Haran is the one who gets married first. Then we see that Nahor marries his niece, her name's Milcah, and then there's this woman named Sarai, and she hops in there eventually. There's this girl named Yiska. We don't know who Yiska is because Haran dies. There's all this weird stuff going on. Oh, and by the way, Sarai is childless. She can't have kids, which kind of just feels like a rude detail to throw in there all of a sudden. This is a weird family, but there's a secret hidden in this family tree that's going to blow your mind. Trust me, it blew my mind too. And even if you've already heard this thing that I'm going to say before, just act like it blew your mind. I'm sure it blew your mind the first time you heard it. So the problem is Yiska. Let's look back at her for a second. Yiska is the younger daughter, apparently, of Haran. There's Lot, who's a son, and then Milcah's a daughter, and Yiska's a daughter, and Nahor marries Milcah. Bada bing, bada boom. What's weird is that she's in the genealogy at all. Now, not to be rude, not to be like sexist or misogynistic or whatever, but women shouldn't really be in genealogies. Based on all the genealogies of this time period that we found, women were rarely in genealogies. They almost never show up. And they only show up if they're crucially important to the story. If there's some detail or story about this woman that makes a huge difference in the family tree. So the idea that Yiska gets mentioned one time and then she just disappears, it's just weird that she would be mentioned at all. And what's even weirder is that there's this oral tradition among Jewish rabbis called midrashes. Say that with me, midrash. You're amazing at Hebrew. And midrashes were additional stories told by Jewish rabbis that would never contradict the text. It'd be like an addendum, like a little added story that helped explain the Bible a little bit better. And there's this one Jewish midrash where apparently the rabbis used to teach that Avram married Yiska. Yeah, that's weird. That would contradict the text, right? Because Avram doesn't marry Yiska, he marries Sarai. He would never marry Yiska. That doesn't make any sense. So we got to do a little look at language. Check this out. In the Hebrew language, Sarai means princess, or it means my princess. Now, in the Chaldean language, which is where they came from, right? Yiska also means my princess. Wow. Okay, that totally makes more sense now. So yes, Avram did marry Yiska because he married Sarai because it's my princess. He married princess. And that's Sarai and Yiska. Sarai and Yiska are the same person. Now, what happens when you learn that fact that Avram married Yiska? I know I'm getting really convoluted here, but stay with me. Once you understand that Avram married Yiska, a really interesting picture gets painted. Look at this. So what we see here is we have two sons, Avram and Nahor, who need wives. And then we have two daughters, Milcah and Yiska, who need husbands. And not just that, they need protection. These are two women in like 4000 BC or something, right? They don't have any rights. They don't have any protection or anything. And in fact, one of these women, Yiska, Sarai, is barren. She can't have children. She's unable to bear children, which would add a special level of pressure on her life because in this society, she was essentially unmarriable. And so what we see is this picture where Avram, who's the eldest son, would be given the opportunity to choose between his nieces. Now, I know it's nieces, that's weird, leave it alone. Avram would be able to choose between Milcah, who, for all we know, is totally able to have children, or he can pick Yiska, who can't have children. And he intentionally chooses Yiska. That's interesting. And it's even more interesting when you realize that Yiska can't have children. Now, what's presumed in this story is that Avram already knew that Yiska couldn't have children. He understood ahead of time that Sarai, Yiska, was unable to do this. And we know this because there's no realization story later on, right? Afterwards, we don't get some story in the Bible about and then Avram realized that Yiska couldn't have children. He was super upset. That doesn't happen. And based on the math of how old Sarai would have needed to be, we would know that she was past the marrying age, right? Once a woman turned 12 or 13, essentially in this society, she was up for marriage. And so anybody could come and ask to marry her. But something apparently happened where she was never asked to be married. She was never married off. And so in this society, she's on the verge of being an outcast. She has no father to protect her. She has no husband. She can't have children of her own to protect her and take care of her in this life. So what's going to happen to Sarai? This matters because what we see is that Avram intentionally chooses the quote unquote bad decision. He intentionally chooses Sarai. And what this teaches us is that Avram is not a me first guy. Avram has the choice to continue his family line and have sons and do all the stuff that you're supposed to do as the eldest son. But instead, he thinks it's more important to give dignity and to give provision to a barren woman. That's really, really cool. I hope you see how cool that is. Avram is the eldest. He has a lot of pressure on him as the oldest son, and he still intentionally chooses to protect this woman who can't do anything for him in the society. He chooses to protect her rather than protecting his own name. And what a name that was. Think about Avram's name. Avram literally means, in Hebrew, it means exalted father. And he just made a conscious decision to not have kids. You know, in this society, you were supposed to live up to your name. Your name meant something. And all of these early Genesis names meant something. And you're supposed to live up to it. And so Avram has two choices, right? He can do it God's way, in which he has no visible opportunity for children. He's completely trusting God's story. Or he can do it his own way. He can get obsessed with acquiring children and guarantee his line by marrying Milcah. He can try to manifest destiny, his own heritage. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he chooses Yiscah. He chooses the bad option because he knows that it's the right thing to do. And what happens immediately after this, Genesis 12, verse 1, you can go check it out. God immediately enters Abraham's life. Immediately he goes, Avram, go to this place. And what I think happened right there is that God sees Avram make this choice and he goes, oh yeah, this guy gets it. This is somebody I can work with. This is somebody who knows how to trust the story. This is somebody who's not obsessed with acquiring and not obsessed with himself. He's somebody who knows when to say enough. Avram gets it. And Avram, listen, Avram's gonna make a ton of mistakes. He's gonna do a lot of weird stuff in this story that you go like, really? God chose this guy? But he gets the core ideas. He understands the story and he understands his place in the story, and he ends up being an incredible partner to God. In this little genealogy, 5 verses, this tiny genealogy, we find out everything we need to know about what it means to be a good partner to God. We find out everything we need to know about Avram. And we're forced to consider some interesting questions for ourselves. That main question is, what kind of partner will I be? What kind of partner do I want to be for God? Do I get it? Am I like Abraham? Avram? Am I selfless, or am I me first? Who would I have chosen? Because, in retrospect, oh yeah, I would have chosen Sarai because it's the right thing to do. But in the moment, as the eldest son, with the entire pressure of the world on you, it seems, would you make the selfless decision? Will your biggest decisions be defined by an obsession with acquiring, or defined by selflessness? The big question, do you trust God's story? That's the question. That's the question that'll define your entire life. It'll define the biggest decisions that you make in this life. Do you trust God's story? Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look at all of these different stories of Abraham and his descendants, and we're going to learn how Abraham became God's partner and how God honored his promises to Abraham immediately. It's such a cool story. There's so much good stuff in there. I really encourage you to check out the Bema podcasts in order to understand a little bit better what we're trying to do. Like I said, I think I said this before. I hope I did. We're borrowing heavily from this Bema podcast hosted by a guy named Marty Solomon that's full of depth and insight and mind-blowing ideas. Like I got this whole idea from Bema today. I really encourage you to check out those podcasts. If you're not a podcaster, we're going to go over a few of these lessons over the next few weeks. But I encourage you to answer these questions for yourself this week. Are you me first? Do you trust God's story, or are you obsessed with acquiring? Most importantly, what kind of partner do you want to be to God? Have a great Sunday. God bless. To God be the glory.